Gilmore, who is a researcher at the University of Manchester, and she's going to say a few words about this.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. I just wanted to give a bit of a background to these cases before we hear from the other speakers, from the organisers, the lawyers and some of the people who've been directly affected by the cases. My role in this really, I'm a researcher at the University of Manchester, and I began looking into what happened around these protests a year and a half ago. They seem to me to be something represent something of a shift in terms of the way in which the police treated protest, and particularly the way in which the police treated Muslim protesters. And for that reason I thought they were quite significant, and my research has really uncovered a lot of what's happened around these cases and sort of generated some awareness of them as well. These demonstrations, first of all, I think were hugely significant. Firstly, they were absolutely huge. The demonstration on the 10th of January 2009 was the largest demonstration in solidarity in support of the Palestinian cause in this country, in British history. It was absolutely massive. Up to 150,000 people demonstrated outside the Israeli embassy against the massacre that was happening in Gaza at the time. These demonstrations were also very mixed. They involved large numbers of Muslim people who came out onto the streets to demonstrate, but also Jews, Christians, trade unionists, all sorts of people who came out. They were very, very mixed demonstrations, very lively, very vibrant demonstrations, and also, of course, very angry demonstrations. The police response, as many of you who I'm sure were at the demonstrations will be aware, the police response to these demonstrations was an absolute outrage. The police systematically attacked the demonstration on the 3rd of January in the Hyde Park underpass, and again on the 10th of January outside the Israeli embassy. And the violence that we saw at these demonstrations was really on a scale that we haven't seen in the UK for over a decade. It really marked a return to the bad old days of protest policing in the UK. We saw the type of tactics we saw at these demonstrations were subsequently exposed around the G20, but protesters were kettled or carolled in large numbers, held in freezing temperatures for hours at a time. They were attacked with long shields, which the police used for the first time in 8 years, I think, in this country, which we use primarily, I think, as a weapon if you look at any of the footage from those demonstrations. There were reports that the police used CS gas outside the Israeli embassy, and they've not confirmed or denied that to me, but we do have reports, although they won't say whether that was true or not. And there was a widespread use of counter-terrorism legislation, of terrorism stop and search powers, to try and prevent people from entering the demonstrations. So the demonstrations and the way in which the police treated the demonstrations were hugely significant, but the reason we're here today really is about what happened after these demonstrations in terms of the mass arrests which happened in the weeks and months following the demonstrations. And I think what these arrests represented really was it was a coordinated attack on the right to protest, and I think really an attempt to criminalise protesters, particularly Muslim protesters, who were directly affected by them. So I'll just give a very sort of brief, I'm conscious we've got quite a few speakers, I'll give a very sort of brief background to the arrests. This policing operation was codenamed Operation Ute, and following the demonstrations the police released CCTV images to the local and national newspapers of people who were wanted for violent disorder outside of the Israeli embassy, and people had their pictures plastered all over the front page of newspapers as these really violent extremists who were wanted by the police. And one of them was actually listed on the Crime Watch Top 10 Most Wanted. His actions were apparently that severe. The police arrested 119 people following these demonstrations, which was the largest number of people arrested in relation to a political demonstration, again for over a decade. 79 of those people were charged with offences, and 69 of those were initially charged with violent disorder. And this is one of the most serious public order offences. It carries a maximum sentence of 5 years imprisonment. So these were extremely serious charges which were launched against these people. The vast majority of those arrested were Muslim. The overwhelming majority, in fact, were Muslim, despite what I said earlier about the fact that these were not exclusively Muslim demonstrations. In fact, they were very mixed. And yet the vast majority of those arrested were Muslim, generally between about 17 and 25 years old, so very, young Muslim people. And for many of them, it was actually the first ever political demonstration that they'd ever been on. So these weren't seasoned political activists, these were young people who were attending their first ever demonstration. Many of them were students involved in charity work and, you know, normal sort of young people. The majority of those who were charged pleaded guilty to the offences they were accused of for a number of reasons. Generally, they were advised that if they pleaded guilty that they would expect a lower sentence, a non-custodial sentence. In fact, as we all know, that didn't happen, and now 22 people have been sent to prison, are currently serving lengthy prison sentences between 6 months and 2.5 years. The cases are ongoing. There are still some cases, some trials to be heard. One appeal's been successful, somebody's been released, and 2 appeals have so far failed. And I think Imran's going to talk a little bit more about some of the appeals which are going through the courts. I just wanted to talk a little bit as well, very briefly, about the way that these people have been treated, and I think it's quite significant. They weren't treated as if they were ordinary criminal suspects or, you know, ordinary political protesters. These people were treated as if they were terrorist suspects. So if you look at the way in which people were arrested, for example, the arrests frequently involved large numbers of territorial support group police officers who burst into houses of these young people at 5 a.m. They often handcuffed family members in one room while they seized laptops, possessions, to search for any sort of extremist type literature, they said to the families. And they took the young people to the police station, they interrogated them on their religious and political beliefs in some cases. Some people were interviewed without lawyers, and they were tarnished and labelled as extremists and fanatics in some of the tabloid press reports which came about afterwards. Now, the impact of these cases, we're going to hear from a couple of people who've been really directly affected by what's happened here. The impact, as you can imagine, has been absolutely terrible. A large number of people have effectively had their lives ruined by what's happened in these cases. Some have lost places at university, some have been unable to have jobs, families have been absolutely devastated, many are suffering from psychiatric problems, depression and so on, which is absolutely understandable when you look at the way that they've been treated. In contrast to what's happened to the protesters, none of the complaints made following the demonstrations have been investigated in any way, in any independent way, by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. So there were 30 complaints made to the IPCC. There was quite a substantial document which was sent to the police by Stop the War and the other organisers of the demonstrations, which warned the police that if they continued to use these tactics, then somebody would be killed. 3 months later, Ian Tomlinson was killed after being struck from behind by a member of the same territorial support group who policed the Gaza demonstrations. So none of the lessons were learned following these demonstrations, and they had devastating consequences as a result. I just want to finally briefly sort of say that I don't think that these cases can really be seen in isolation. This represented, as I said, a shift and a systematic attack on the right to protest and a criminalisation of the Muslim community. But what we've seen since then, I think, has been quite significant. In Bolton, for example, in March this year, there was a demonstration organised by Unite Against Fascism against the English Defence League, who are a fascist group who wanted to stage a protest in Bolton. The police in that case used what had happened in terms of these arrests and charges and convictions in order to deter people from coming out onto the streets. They've said if you go into Bolton Town Centre, you'll be arrested, you'll be charged. They said the local council sent letters to people, the Muslim people within the Muslim community, and asked them to keep their children locked up during the day to prevent them going into Bolton Town Centre, to stop them taking part in the demonstration. So I think in addition to exposing what's happened in these cases, we need to see really this as a systematic attack on the right to protest, and particularly on Muslim protesters. And really, I think the attempt to criminalise the Muslim community through the anti-terror legislation, through the rampant Islamophobia in the mainstream press that we've seen, and through these attacks on the right to protest is something which must be resisted by each and every one of us. The right to protest should be the right to protest for all and not for the minority. And I'd like to sort of pass over now to some people who can talk in a bit more detail about the legal cases and again some of the personal experiences that they've had as well.